I'm not saying Japanese are never angry. They are. Sometimes they are. But it comes with all these other considerations. And then I think, once you're there, it's not just they're angry just like us, and then they're expressing it different. There are all these reasons why Japanese might not be angry like we are. And then even when they are, they probably won't express it.
Batja Mesquita is a social psychologist, an affective scientist, and a pioneer of cultural psychology. She's a professor of psychology at the University of Leuven, Belgium, and director of the Center for Social and Cultural Psychology at the University of Leuven. Today, we're going to be talking about her groundbreaking book called Between Us: How Cultures Create Emotions. Professor Mesquita, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Zata, for having me.
Your ideas have a particular resonance with me. We had a really short chat before I pressed record because I'm from the Balkans originally, but I lived in Germany for almost 10 years. However, as if that wasn't challenging enough, I upped the ante and moved to Japan about a year and a half ago. And, say what you will about the Germans and Germany, and people do say a lot, particularly on social media. There's a lot of funny memes, things like the brutal directness of Germans or the scary German stare when you're riding the U-Bahn. But at least I was still embedded in a European cultural context. Now I'm not anymore. So I'm going to try my best to not turn this interview into a manual for like my personal use. Although maybe yeah. I should just do that. We'll see. We'll see where it goes. But in any case, what we should definitely do at the beginning is define what emotions are. Because I always thought, it's pretty simple. It's pretty basic. Emotions are just feelings, and those should be universal. But your work suggests it might be a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, apart from the fact that would be circular, right? We're talking about emotions and then we're saying their feelings. That's just another word. But I think when I wouldn't pretend that I have the definition of emotions, in part because there is no definition of emotions. Scientists don't agree on it, and lay people in different cultures don't agree on what emotions are exactly. But what we can agree on, I think, is that we talk about emotions when we have responses to situations that are not habitual, that are not common. So something unusual happens, something that I need to tend to. It can be something bad, like this was not what I wanted, or this was not what I expected, or it can be something good. This is really what I want, or it's what I have been working for. And that usually relates to negative and positive emotions. So that's what I mean. I'm just observing that when we talk about emotions, that usually the category of psychological reactions that we're talking about.
Psychological reaction. We had this psychology class in high school for a year, and I remember this page on emotions in our textbook. It was actually a series of photographs, portraits of actors displaying various emotional states.
Yeah. It was really reassuring, right? We
exactly.
Just knew
it was so simple.
Yeah.
Things were so simple back then.
Yeah.
And then there were descriptions of like physical changes on each face. For example, like lowered eyebrows meant anger, wide eyes meant shock or something. But the main thing I remember is that those expressions of emotions were supposed to be universally understood across cultures. That, for example, wide eyes paired, I don't know, with like an open mouth always and everywhere signifies shock. Is that not the case?
Well, there are many things to say about that. The short answer is no, that's not the case. One is that when you are surprised or shocked or afraid, you don't always look that way. That's not true it's not true in European or Western cultures. It's not true anywhere. Those faces were carefully selected to match a certain prototype. And the other thing is that if you ask people spontaneously what those faces mean, they actually don't use those words. So it really, even in Western cultures, it really only is when you give them a choice between 5 or 6 emotion words that they say, okay, well, if it has to be one of those, I think this is the closest. And then they, do reasonably well, which is to say above chance. And they make mistakes as you would expect them. So, for example, there's only one positive emotion in that row, in that list of words, which is happiness, and they can match the happy face with the happy word. And so, probably we don't know exactly. There are different ideas about what faces really mean, and it's not to say that faces have no expression or that we can't read anything about faces. But what we know is, some of what faces say is just, is it good or bad? We also know that even the good or bad can change when we see those faces in a different environment. So the same face can look as happy or sad, depending on in what context you put it. And psychologists have done experiments in which they show that a face can go from disgust to happiness, depending on the situations that is either depicted or described. And then, across cultures, there are even more differences in that, the further away you are from a Western culture, the lower the recognition rate is. And it probably means that there is something that faces express, but it's not emotions. That's the most likely. Some people say, for example, that some of the facial expressions have, that's kind of a Darwinian explanation, that they're associated with function. So when I'm surprised or afraid, I have my eyes wide open. Well, probably because in both cases you need more information. So, it's not always that you're surprised and you have your big eyes open, but the other way around, when you have your eyes wide open and you're surprised, it could be because you want to have more information. You want to let the stimuli come in. So the simple idea of 6 universal emotions that are neatly communicated by these 6 different displays that we can universally recognize, no, that's not true.
Yeah, the context in which a face appears does make a lot of sense. If you're watching a scary movie and they do make this, shock, horror face, whatever, you immediately go, oh, okay, of course, because they're scared. But, if I think about it, if that same expression would appear in a different setting, it could mean something completely else.
Yeah, and it does.
Does.
Yeah, it does. We have research showing that it does, that the same faces can be interpreted in very different ways depending on a different context.
That's already a little bit shocking to me, which is a good sign. I listened to another interview you did, and you said, for example, that anger is not just a feeling, but also something that happens between two people.
Yeah.
What did you mean by this, something that happens?
Yeah. So, I would say in all cultures, we would say that anger, it's intuitive, I think, that anger is not just a feeling inside me, but that if I'm angry, that affects our relationship, right? Especially when I'm angry at you, you understand that something is going to happen. My anger is a way of saying, I don't accept this. I think you're to be blamed, and I don't accept this. It's probably also a good predictor of that if you don't change your behavior, that I'm going to do something that makes it very clear that I don't accept it. And so I would say that anger is not always equally effective, or it's not always interpreted in exactly the same way, but it certainly has an interpersonal aspect in it. And that is true when, that's true we find that in psychological research done in Western countries. Like if I'm angry and I'm negotiating with you, then you as a negotiator are more likely to give me a better bid than if I'm not angry, than if I'm neutral. If I'm happy, actually, you think, oh, the bid could be a little lower. So we certainly take interpersonal messages from anger, even in Western cultures. But in many cultures, that's actually the primary way in which people look at emotions, is what happens in this emotional episode between people. So in many culture, the emotion of anger is defined in terms of what it does between people. And the feeling is kind of secondary. Not to say that people don't feel something, but the real important thing is that something is happening between people.
So more like in a functional sense, less in like I'm feeling a certain way sort of sense.
Yeah, or more, you could say that. You could also say it's more an interpersonal than a subjective or individual event.
Let's be a bit more exact. Let's say that I'm a European working in Europe and I'm angry at my boss. At the same time, there's also a Japanese man in Japan who's angry at his boss. Now, I understand that the expressions of anger might be different in these two cases, but are we feeling the same thing?
Yeah, there's a lot of presuppositions here.
Yeah.
For example,
I hope you'll indulge me.
Yeah.
Yes.
For example, that the Japanese guy is angry at his boss, that would be very unusual, actually. Because in order to be angry, you have to understand that, or you have to suppose that you're deserving something more than you're getting, that you're entitled, and that you are in a position to not accept, and that you can do that in this very direct way. So does the Japanese, I wouldn't even say that I would know exactly what you felt if you were if you were another European worker who was angry at their boss. I mean, a lot of considerations go into that feeling of being being angry. Do you think it's really unfair? Are you just frustrated? Do you think your boss is a pushover, or do you think that you will face retributions? So all of those things are going to go into the angry feeling. But now, if I'm Japanese, I think, first of all, that angry is an immature and bad emotion,
especially when you're not in a power position and defend the norms. I mean, when you're angry, you are certainly concerned that you will violate or that you will threaten the harmony. And you may wonder, and that's what a lot of people that we included in our research did. You may wonder what you have done wrong, that your boss did this. So a lot of I'm not saying Japanese are never angry. They are. Sometimes they are. But it comes with all these other considerations. And then I think, once you're there, it's not just they're angry just like us, and then they're expressing a difference. There are all these reasons why Japanese might not be angry like we are. And then even when they are, they probably won't express it.
Wow. Well, it's interesting that in the book you point out that an important aspect of what you're talking about is the fact that in different cultures, we have different value systems, like you just said, when it comes to emotions. And probably the most fascinating of those is shame, which in the West is usually seen as the Satan of emotions. The mantra usually goes that in order to achieve mental well-being, you have to liberate yourself from any sense of shame. However, in other cultures, and again, Japan comes to mind, you say shame is a much more, almost like a desirable emotion. Can you break that down a little bit?
Yeah. So in many cultures, let me first break down. I think the reason that shame is so bad in Western cultures, I think, is that because it does two things that we don't like. One is it threatens our self-esteem, and our dignity is based on what we think about ourselves, of our internal value. And the other is it makes clear that we're dependent on other people's judgment, and we don't like that either. Now, in cultures where other people's judgments are foregrounded anyway, where you where your value is always in the eyes of other people, and where you want to really accommodate or look good according to the norms and the roles that I shared. Shame is well, first of all, shame tells other people that you're aware of those norms and that you care about being a good person in the system. And shame probably also has different consequences in that other people accept you for it, that it's a good thing to have. So I think in the case of shame, there are many, many uh, cultures in which shame is a good thing that needs to be taught to kids and that make kids, well behaved, consider knowing their position in the hierarchy, knowing their role. And so they're included rather than excluded. It's a sign of inclusion if you can feel shame.
Speaking of the West, we have this strong belief that every emotion kind of has to be expressed. The height of self-actualization and also health is if I'm expressing myself fully at all times, at least as much as I can. And if I'm always authentic to myself, this kind of language. Would you say that that is a universal ideal that we should all be striving for, no matter which culture we belong to?
No, that also seems to be related to the idea that it's very important to be an authentic self and that
Yes.
the focus is on the self. We don't know exactly why it doesn't work that way. We know that if Western people suppress their emotions, that they feel them more strongly. We have some research that shows that physiological reactions become stronger, that people make a lot of effort, and that it's exhausting to suppress your emotions. And also some evidence that people who suppress their emotions a lot have less satisfying relationships and are less liked.
Right. And we're talking about Westerners right now,
But
right?
here we're talking about Westerners.
Yeah.
None of that. So this was the setup of saying that none of that we find with, for example, Asians or Asian Americans. So we don't find that people who suppress their emotions feel their emotions more intensely. We don't find that it has any negative effect on their relationship. We don't find that it's exhausting or effortful. So we don't find the kind of burnout that you find in Western populations where there's a lot of suppression. You don't find that in Asian populations, and we can only assume that it's either because the fact itself of not feeling authentic is bad. That could be one of the reasons that suppression is a bad thing. Or you can say that maybe just practicing suppressing makes it effortless. So we don't really know what the underlying system is. We only know that this idea that you have to express emotions doesn't seem to hold true for a lot of other cultures. That it's not at all. It's unclear whether it always holds true for Western cultures either. I mean, we also have the sayings of count till 10 until your anger is gone. And we don't really have evidence that people count to 10 then explode. We have the evidence that sometimes that works. So I would say it's a little simplistic, even in a Western context, to say that suppression always hurts. But we do have quite a bit of evidence that it can hurt, suppressing emotions. And we have very little evidence, actually, in some other cultural contexts.
Wow, that is blowing my mind right now. I think at least in like common parlance, you would actually assume that somebody who's not, authentically expressing their emotions, is there's something they have like a duplicitous nature, or maybe, there's bad intentions. In an extreme case, you would call this person a sociopath, like adjusting their emotional response or whatever to the situation. So it's actually the inverse.
I think what is interesting about that is this idea that an emotion exists kind of like the movie Inside Out. The emotion is already formed inside you, and then you decide to not express it. And that's very inauthentic because it lives in your head.
Yeah.
And I think there is an alternative to thinking about your emotions as living inside into your head, which is that emotions are a process of meaning making. And so it's not that the emotion of anger is there right away, but you think, oh, I don't like this. And then you say, I deserve better. And then you say, I guess that person should have given me that. And then you say, no, I should really, I should claim this. So the idea is that if this is all the steps in context and in a relationship that ultimately amount to a feeling or an interpretation of the world that we call angry, then in each of those steps, something else could be happening. And so that's what I think happens in many other cultures, that I don't like this. Okay, maybe I don't like it, but that's not anger, right? You could also say, what did I do wrong that this interaction is going off path or off route? What can I do something? Why would this person think this about me? So I think that the meaning making in context, also the cues that you get from other people. No, you should be angry. You deserve this. This can all be different in different cultures. The kind of the scripts that are available to you. Are you thinking about what happens to you all the time in I'm entitled to this? Or do you think, okay, this is fate. I might have liked it differently, but God wanted this for me, or whatever, or fate wanted this for me, or sometimes things go well, sometimes they don't go well. I mean, each of those interpretations of the world amounts or doesn't amount to building up anger. And I think that's how you have to think about emotions, to understand that, no, it doesn't have to be inauthentic to not feel angry. It can just be a matter of a different interpretation, of a different focus, of different cues in the environment, of different habits of coming to terms with things that you don't like. And so if you think about it, then there is not really an authentic emotion. There may be an emotion that you've become used to. There may be in habitual ways of interpreting certain events. But it's not like one habitual way of interpreting event is necessarily more authentic than another.
So do emotions even exist without culture then? For example, I don't know, if you found one of these unfortunate wolf children in the woods or something, there were a couple of cases in history. Would you recognize their emotional states as, anger, fear, etc., happiness, or not?
The thing is that if you grew up with anger and fear, you might recognize it in them, because
Right.
we recognize those in our pets, in our cats and dogs, or
Yeah.
our guinea pigs. That doesn't mean they have them in the same way as we do. So do they have it in the same way? I would say not, because part of the emotions that we have are the connotations, the associations that we have. Do we have, is there anything emotional about us if we don't grow up in a culture? Yes, for sure. I mean, whether you want to call that an emotion or not is also a matter of definition and agreement. We usually don't, but you could say, we're all equipped to like certain things and not like other things. We're all equipped. I mean, even bacteria can move towards the light and nutrition, and can move away from toxic environments. So is that an emotion? I would say not. But are we equipped with liking or, coming up, recognizing our concerns? Yes, for sure. Can we, what is the level of distinction that we can make when we don't have language, when we don't have culture, when we don't have other people to help us interpret? That's, the kids who are raised by the wolves do not speak a language. And I don't know the literature so precisely, but I think they lose their ability to learn a language in the way that kids who grow up with parents do. And so, yeah, our nervous system is being developed in a cultural environment in the proximity of other people who help us interpret what the world is like. And so who are important in forming our emotions or our emotional habits.
Okay, just to pick up on this repressing emotions thing a little bit, because I am a hypochondriac, I will admit that. So, and there's quite a few clips doing the rounds on social media of famous healthcare professionals claiming that negative emotions, if pent up and if left unexpressed, particularly anger again, can lead to physical diseases, like bad ones, like multiple sclerosis, cancer, etc. But then how come in cultures where expressing anger is not a desirable thing? Again, we talked about Japan. Presumably people are doing it less then. They're not just dropping dead all over the place.
Yeah,
How do we square up the two?
it's worse than that. Negative emotions actually don't predict a whole number of health outcomes that they do predict in US samples.
Wow.
Um, so there again, it seems to be we don't really, we know that there is no association between negative emotions and a whole series of health outcomes in Japan, for example. We don't know exactly why, but one of the reasons could be that is the meaning that emotions has in our, if it's true that we define ourselves by emotions, then having negative emotions by internal feelings, then having negative internal feelings may be more consequential. So it may be more a meta effect of what we think about those emotions or how those emotions, what the effect is of those emotions in our interpersonal life, in our personal life, than the emotions themselves. Um, no. So it's people do not drop that. Who there are many ways in which there are many ways to be a human being, and what what I think is happening is cultures help individuals to regulate their bodily system, and they do that in different ways. So one way is through the language of emotion and in the regulation of emotions, and that's a very Western system. And what we see is that people in different cultures don't talk about their emotions in the same way, don't experience them in the same way, don't express them in the same way. And so the question is, I think a fairer question would be, so what are the ways in which those cultures help their individuals regulate their bodies? And I have an idea. For example, we co-construct in a lot of cultures, people co-construct situations that keep them in balance. In a lot of cultures, situations are less left to the lives are less left to the initiative of individuals than in Western contemporary societies. So it may well be that cultural regulations also occurs through prescribing roles, through being predictable, having more predictable interpersonal relationships, more scripts, and less through subjective emotion regulation. But that's me guessing, having a hunch. Um, but I don't think that we all have emotions in the same way. I don't think that that's a natural.
So it's actually more about what sort of meaning do I ascribe to certain emotions. So hypothetically, would it be possible for me to retrain myself? Let's take the example of shame. And I see shame in a negative light and I have negative feelings about it. But if I train myself through manipulation, whatever, and suddenly saw shame in a positive light, would I be able to actually flourish while feeling shame?
I think you can certainly learn to, that's what we do with people who are excessively angry, for example, or
Yeah.
kids who are excessively angry. We try to tell them that there are other ways of achieving their goals. We try to tell them that it's not so positive. Um, I'm sure that some of the feelings of shame can be trained over time. But what you have to realize is that the fact that it's learnable doesn't mean that you have, that with the snap of your finger, that you have relearned experiences that you have had for a whole life. And the other part that you're mentioning is true too, is that we live in an environment where shame has a certain meaning. So you cannot by yourself, all independent from your environment, change the meaning of shame completely. You can try to move it. You can try to convince other people about it. You can, as societies change, I mean, the cultural meaning of those emotions do change over time. It's not a fixed entity. We know that the meaning of certain emotions does change over time. We have historians describing that process. So it's not fixed. But is it learning? Is it just by saying to yourself, from now on, I'm going to see shame as a pro-social emotion? Good luck. That's not so easy.
Right.
But you can try to. I mean, it certainly has helped me to see the other side of shame. And there are philosophers, for example, who say, in Western cultures, we could use a little more of the shame of, say, caring about what other people think about you or how you could improve yourself. And we could use a little less of the anger of what I'm entitled to. And that would make us maybe a better society. I'm a psychologist, so I just describe. But you can certainly second guess the meaning of those emotions and try to understand what they mean for other people. And I think that realizing that they can have that different meaning does change something in the experience of your own emotions. But it doesn't change overnight. Something that you've learned, for 30, 40, 50, 60 years isn't going to disappear because you think about it once in a different way. It's a lifelong experience. But experiences are people continue to have new experiences. So this could be one of them.
Yeah, even if I succeeded, I mean, and became like completely shameless and thought it was a good thing, I would create an outcast of myself, like an eccentric at the best and like a total outcast in society
I don't
at
know
worst.
I don't know that there's any culture where people are shameless. But because it's a very social emotion. But there are cultures where shame is given a place and seen as something positive for society. And there are cultures where shame is really not giving a positive place, where it's only considered to be to be dysfunctional. And I think many Western societies are closer to the dysfunctional view, and I don't think that's completely right. I mean, shame has clear functions because it keeps you committed to the norms. I mean, if I didn't have shame, I would walk around naked if it were warm, and scream at the top of my lungs. I wouldn't consider the opinions of others, and so shame makes me the social person that I am. Um, but I think, yeah, in terms of how positive or negative is it, or how much does it how negatively or positively does it reflect on the person who feels it? I think it can be different cross-culturally and also between individuals.
It's also really interesting when you said about this kind of maxim in the West: you shouldn't care about what other people think. We grew up with that kind of like the ultimate badass was a person who didn't care what anybody else thinks, and you
Yeah.
thought this person has no problems at all, you know. And now I've grown up a little bit, it doesn't sound like the best advice out there, to be honest. To be
No.
honest, because how do you not care about what people that you care about or that you love think? I mean, that you'll probably be a psychopath or
Yes,
something.
exactly. That's the definition of a psychopath. Exactly. So most people, when we say we don't feel shame, I mean, some sociologists say it's the unstated emotion. It's what everybody even in Western cultures, it's the emotion that everybody tries to avoid coming to the foreground. But everybody has shame or embarrassment constantly. And that's how we keep our interactions normal. Of course we care. I mean, if we didn't care about each other, there would be no relationship, no socially appropriate behavior. So that's the absolute definition of a human being, is that we care about others. And we couldn't live without caring about others, or without being part of a social community. So really, shame is what we absolutely need to live in groups. It's what we absolutely, we want to avoid it from being too big and too painful. But exactly that's the motivation that shame gives us. And so it's, one of the ways of saying of shame is the ultimate social emotions that makes us into social beings. So we couldn't live without it. And if we do, we end up in prison or hurting a lot of people otherwise.
That's an extremely refreshing take. Speaking of caring about others, once again, I want to turn to a specific emotion. It's a big one: love. Again, in the West, we've been brought up with this very specific idea of romantic love, usually personified in romantic comedies we all watched, in Disney movies, where each person has a soulmate wandering, out there. And once you find this person, you're going to live out the rest of your days together with the same intensity of romantic and sexual emotions. And if
Yeah.
you don't, something's wrong. You failed. I'm guessing that's also quite a specific interpretation of love. That's not a given everywhere around the world.
Well, it's an interpretation of love that doesn't really align with the facts, even in middle class
You talk about divorce
Western.
rates.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But still, apart from that, yeah, there are in many places of the world, that's not how people think about it. There's not a special person. I think oh, I can say a few things about it. One is that in many cultures of the world, romantic love doesn't coincide with love, right? There are arranged marriages still in many places of the world. And there's actually no evidence that those marriages do worse than marriages that start out with romantic love. So that's a way of looking at love: is you care about another person, you live your life together. There's also many cultures where love is less of a strong individual feeling and more of what you do with each other, how you show it to each other. But then there are a lot of cultures, and I think that's what you're referring to, where where they're not so much focused on love in the way of finding somebody very special, but love in the way of being sad for them if things don't work out. In many cultures, the word for love is the same word as for empathy and as for sadness. And so that's a very different kind of love than the love that goes with, let's say, extreme happiness. And it's because it's not what you feel for somebody whom you selected and because they're so special, but it's the feeling you have for somebody you're related to and for whom you're responsible to some extent. And then the other thing that I want to say is that the obsession with love, I mean, everybody, of course, in all societies, people know something like love. I'm sure that mothers do something for their children and want them to stay alive. But what form that takes is very different. So there's first, there is the feeling of love. This child is very special, and there's the feeling of love. You don't want them to feel sad, but you feel sad for them because you know what life is going to bring to them. And then there are cultures where there's just less focus on love and more focus on, because we're all related anyway, more focus on what can go wrong in relationships. So a lot of focus on envy, a lot of focus on what might happen if people close to you hate you, if they're your enemies. So the idea that, love is the ultimate emotion and the emotion towards which societies are geared is a very modern Western idea that is adopted by some industrializing countries to some extent, but is far from universal as the main focus of emotional life.
The world is becoming more global and like more multicultural than ever. And with it, there's going to be more and more intercultural relationships. What advice would you give to people finding themselves in one of these? This is going to be advice for me, basically, to kind of minimize the frequency of sort of emotional lost in translation moments that can cause friction.
I think seeking translation is the right approach. So one of the things that I'm trying to say in the book is that we need to be humble. That it's good to think that all of the things that we talked about, that okay, this is suppressing your emotion may not feel good for you, but maybe there's nothing wrong with it for another person. Maybe you have to be angry in one culture, but there's nothing wrong about never being angry in another culture. And I think to be humble and recognize that it could be very different for different people is the first step. Second step that is related to it is that your own emotions are cultured as well. Just because I feel them doesn't mean that they're universal. And then I think the way I would approach is be curious and try to understand what another person feels, does, how they see the situation, what it means to them, what kind of an emotion they would self-ascribe or would describe in you. Is that a bad or a good emotion to them? How do they think it would work out if they had that? All of those things. I think we should be on a path of discovery rather than thinking that we know what another person will feel like. And I think that's the best advice that at this point I can give to people who have, which is all of us at this point,
Yeah.
have across intercultural relationships.
So being humble and staying curious.
Yes.
Basically. All right.
That would be a very nice summary. Yes.
Sounds simple, maybe deceptively simple, because it's not probably
Deceptively
that easy.
simple. I've been trying my whole life. Yes. Deceptively simple.
Right. One tendency that I noticed while living in Japan is that, I want to I don't want to generalize, but I do notice it in other foreigners as well, is that we want to talk everything out. We want to articulate everything that we feel and, clear the air with words, etc. And my Japanese friends say that reading the room is very important to them.
I was going to say that. Reading the room instead of clearing the air.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm at a loss here because I don't have this skill as much as they do because, I come from another culture.
Yeah.
And I think reading the room is probably a beneficial thing for everybody in a multicultural society. Could you give us some advice there maybe as well?
Well, I mean, the way I understand the Japanese reading the room is that you really try to think from the perspective of another person, but really from the perspective, what would they want? What would they feel? How can I anticipate? How can I how can I accommodate so that it's closer to what they would want? And in a way, that's the opposite from the Western idea of, let me tell you what I want so that you can satisfy my needs. So I think I don't think that's an easy skill, but a skill that you can train yourself on it's a very different approach. And we for example we have done interviews with Japanese couples and Belgian couples and asked them, when you have conflict, what do you think? How do you think that should be approached? And Japanese do say, you should avoid it as much as possible. Should read the room. Should accept differences. Try to anticipate what the other person wants. And Belgians say you need to engage in conflict, speak your mind, and start talking about it. Very different approach. And all I can say is that a little bit more of trying to read the other instead of expressing yourself might be might fit in the road to discovery.
Are we talking about empathy here, or are we talking about something else?
So in my book, I take issue with the word empathy, because it can mean that I try to imagine I try to imagine myself in your skin, and then I try to imagine what I would need. I think empathy is hard interculturally, because I may try to imagine myself in your skin, but I'm not you. I come with different cultural preferences, expectations. And so I think it's a little more than empathy. Anthropologists sometimes call it resonance. I'm trying to find out what is important for you. And I'm trying to find out, given what's important to you, what you would feel and want and do in this situation, and what I could do. So it's a little more complicated, I think, than mere empathy.
Last question, Professor. What about humor? Trying to make people laugh. Do you think that's universal? Because I like to attempt crack a few jokes here and there, usually unsuccessfully. But I want some sort of reassurance that it's worth my while to keep trying, even if I'm in a different cultural context. Do you think that will work, or I'm just gonna embarrass myself further?
I was going to ask you what your experience is. I haven't done any research on it, but usually humor works with pushing some boundaries.
Yes.
But of course, it's easier when you agree on what the boundaries are,
right?
Or when you agree on the normal. So I think in the best case scenario, it may feel in the best case scenario, it appeals to some commonly human expectations, and then it will fly. In the worst possible scenario, you cross the boundaries that others set, and that could work out very badly for you. And somewhere in between, it could just fall flat. But do I think laughing is a good thing? Yeah, I do. Do I think that we can always know what people in other cultures find laughable? I found that, moving to the United States at the time, I found it one of the last things that I learned. I did not think that the stand-up comedians were funny for probably a good 8 years or so. But, keep trying
until I burn all the bridges. I did find
learn from mistakes, I would say.
Right, that's the important bit. I'm a particular fan of like self-deprecating dry humor, and I did find that gets completely lost in translation, because I'm gonna say, oh, I was such a stupid idiot that time. And my Japanese friends will be like, no, why are you saying that about yourself? Don't disparage yourself. Like they're going to be concerned for me. And I'm like, no, I wasn't trying to actually be, disparaging to myself. I'm trying to, lay it on for comedic purposes, but it doesn't work that way. So that was my experience.
Humor is a hard thing to translate, but it's it's keep trying and report back, I would say.
Okay. All right. That would be awesome if I feature in one of your research papers. Professor, thank you so much for taking the time. Where can people find your book? And do you have any social media where you're active, where people can see what you're up to these days?
Yes, I have all social media. And my website is batjamesquita.com.
All right.
And the book they can find there. It's available anywhere. Amazon bookstores.
It is available anywhere.
Actually,
yes, please go ahead.
It has been translated in Japanese.
Yeah, that's how I actually learned about your work. Really? Is that I was walking around a Japanese bookstore and I saw your book prominently featured.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, in the nonfiction section.
Okay.
And it immediately called to me and I was like, well, just going to write. So yeah, it indeed is available.
In Japan. Okay.
Professor Mesquita, thank you so much. This was fascinating.
Thank you, Zaza.
Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I've been told I have to say that, otherwise nothing happens weird. Also, if you feel like it, support me on Patreon. This is a one-person pod. I do everything myself. There's no team behind me, so please feel free to hop on Patreon and find smart cookies on there. And then last but certainly not least, I have to thank my existing patrons. Tovarishi and Tovarishice, you legends, you. Without you, there would be no pod, which makes you actual producers of this show. So eternal thanks to Jush Premro, Nate Sirk, Goran Ivasic, Anje Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaž Maher, Strole, Aida, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordan, Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Tai Chi. Seriously, I'm touched. Thank you so much.